Welcome to this episode of Crops TV. I'm Joel DeYoung. I'm an extension agronomist for 9 counties in the northwest corner of Iowa. Joining me in this presentation will be Andrew Weaver and Landon Leonard. They're both ag specialists at the Northwest Research Farm, and we've got a couple topics for them to share also. A little history before we get into it. We're not fortunate enough to do our Crops Advantage series this year, and we normally do 2 in the northwest corner, 1 in Lamar's and 1 in Sheldon. And for the last 10 years or so, we've always had a workshop session that will focus on work at the Northwest Research Farm, along with our on-farm project results, at least highlight a few things every year so we can continue to share the information of the work that happens at Iowa State and in conjunction with our farmers in Northwest Iowa. So we decided to continue to do that again this year and actually make an episode for Crops TV. And so we hope you learn from it and we hope you enjoy it. These are the topics that we're planning to hit today. I'm going to start a little bit with some Northwest Research Farm overview and then setting the stage for the research that was done this year with the rainfall and moisture, and also talking about some of that work. Landon Leonard's going to spend some time on water quality research, and then Andrew Weaver's going to be back with some row spacing on the research farm, and then also some on-farm projects with soybean plant populations and soybean data planning projects. And then I'll be back on with you again to talk about some corn fungicide comparisons on farm that we've done over the years, and a corn rootworm on farm project that we've had as a 10-year-long project. Quick overview of the Northwest Research Farm. This association was started in the 1950s by a group of farmers in Northwest Iowa, and their goal in life was to create and raise funds to buy property so that Iowa State University could do research in this part of the state. We're a long ways from Ames. We're closer almost to South Dakota State University in many cases than we are to Iowa State University. And the climate's a little different and the soil types are different. And so they raise funds and are working with Iowa State University to actually do research up here. So it's closer to home, and to them it makes more sense. We have 280 acres in O'Brien County at this stage. Most of our small plot work is done at that site in southern O'Brien County. There's another 55-acre farm in Lyon County. We do some on-farm field length trials at that site. We have 10 counties involved in the organization. We have 2 board members from each county. We rely on them to give us ideas what we want to do at summer field days. Of course, they manage dollars. They create ideas for us, and they monitor what's going on. And they give us support to get us equipment, or to at least help fund equipment cooperatively with Iowa State if we need some. One of the things that I'm really proud of that board about is, every year they give us some foresight of what we need to look at in the future. And we're going to talk about water quality a little bit here today. That board decided nearly 20 years ago, and part of their process of figuring out what they want to do for the future, that water quality issues were going to be a huge concern for Iowans and farming. And so they already started encouraging and helping design projects so that we can look at water quality in the state. Now in 2020, there were 43 individual research projects on the Northwest Research Farm. And you'd think with 280 acres plus 55 acres, it wouldn't take 3 staff members, but they have some sideline projects they're in charge of. And, to harvest that many acres, and there's almost 4,800 plots, it takes a lot more time than average harvest. So you give them a lot of credit. It's a lot of work, and the farm always looks good. We also had 22 on-farm projects with cooperators this past year. Before COVID hit, 8 field days, 773 visitors. So we still do some education with them. I am not housed on the farm, but I get that opportunity to work with our farm staff quite a bit. That's actually a picture of the patchwork quilt that is a research farm. Now the lines aren't quite as straight as maybe they should be. These were taken, these are multiple pictures stitched together, taken with a fixed wing drone. But you can see all the different plots that are out there and the comparisons and the replications. It creates quite the patchwork. That's not normal for most ground in Northwest Iowa. There's the research farm staff. Terry Tuttle's the superintendent. He's not going to be speaking today, but he is the guy that is in charge of overall the operations at the Northwest Research Farm. Andrew Weaver is an ag specialist that's housed at the research farm, as is Landon Leonard. Andrew actually has some additional responsibilities with working with all the on-farm projects. Landon's additional responsibilities are making sure all the data is collected and the work's done on all the water quality research projects, besides the normal cropping things that go on at the research farm. So to set the table a little bit for some of this research, it's always nice to know what's going on with the moisture, and some of the results are certainly affected by moisture. Fall of 2020, actually the whole year 2020 was quite dry. In early January, I pulled out the drop monitor map. Hasn't changed much in the last couple, 3 months. You can see that this part of the state that we're in here in the northwest corner is the driest in the state of Iowa right now. This is you can see the extreme drought category through that region, quite a bit of severe drought. We really had a lot less than normal rainfall during the past 12 months. One of the things that I monitor as a field agronomist is some different weather stations in northwest Iowa. When you work in 9 counties, you kind of got to know what's going on in each county, at least from rainfall perspective a little bit. We know that the neighbors got more or less than all of these things, but these are some long-term weather stations that can give us some comparison data. These sites for that table it all comes from the Mesonet ClimaDat page. What's interesting about it is Climo in that table is actually the average that we've seen, and I believe the year range average is 1951 to 2015. So those are the average rainfalls during the time period at all those sites, and that's why I picked these, because they have good long-term data. You'll see that the departure, and I picked April 15th, about the beginning of growing season, to November 1st as a time period to evaluate, mostly because of something we'll share in a minute on soil moistures. But you'll see that we have departures anywhere from about 7.5 to about 12 inches of, over 11 inches less than normal during that time period. Now, there might be parts of the state that have a little bigger departure during that time period, but the northwest corner's normal is lower than most of the rest of the state also. And so the total that we dealt with is less than what we really could have used during the year. You need to remember that a corn and soybean crop needs about 22 to 25 inches of water to be a full crop in most cases. And you can see that we had anywhere from, actually 10 to 12 during the growing season. So we need to make up 10 or more inches of water to keep that crop growing. And it's surprising the yields we got based on that. But we had a lot of moisture come to us through the root zone. We normally assume a rooting depth of about 5 feet. If you want to hear a bigger discussion about that, go back to the Crops TV version that Angie Reek-Hins did on moisture use in a crop. But, you know, at 5 feet, we can hold almost 2 inches of water per foot in northwest Iowa. And so we relied on that pretty heavily. This slide comes from the ISU Soil Moisture Network. These are weather stations across the state that ISU, including at the Northwest Research Farm, has, and that are a little different than a normal weather station. They not only do the rainfall, the wind, and those types of things, they also measure things like sunlight. And then we actually have sensors below crop ground at 12, 24, and 50 inches that have moisture and temperature sensors. So if you go to these websites, you can monitor this data also. This chart, the blue lines are hourly rainfall amounts. And you can see the last right half side of that table from about early July through October. We didn't have a whole lot of rainfall events, definitely much less than normal. The other lines, the red line is actually the moisture sensor at 12 inches. The purple line is the moisture sensor at 24 inches, and the black one is the sensor at 50 inches. And so you can see at the left-hand side that we were pretty much at field capacity early. And on the right-hand side, we pretty much emptied what that soil could hold for the crop. In between, it's always interesting to me to watch what the crop uptake is. And of course, they're going to take the easiest water first, which is the first 12 inches. And then that crop's going to take the 24-inch level. And then they're going to utilize what's at 50 inches. And so you can see out there that a crop use really starts in mid-June, which isn't atypical when the crop really starting to take off. July, the need can be a quarter, a third to 4/10 of an inch a day, depending on the day when we're pollinating and we're in that early pollination time period. But we still need it in August. And fortunately, we still had some in storage as we got into August, but it's not as efficient to pick up water from that depth. So it was interesting to watch where we were at that year. This would show that at 50 inches, we maybe ran out of water a little bit before we got to the end of the season. The difficulty of picking up water from deeper depth probably makes it a little tougher. So we didn't set records on yields. We were maybe close to trend line at that location, but we weren't any better than that. Fortunate we had that much in storage since we were full at the beginning of the year. One of those projects that's a little different in this part of the state than other parts of the state, since we are the driest part of Iowa annually, Paul Castle, my counterpart out of Spencer, and myself usually pull soil moisture samples from pre-selected sites in the northwest corner of Iowa yet. That practice has kind of been dropped in other parts of the state. We still continue to do some of it because we get to be a little more marginal on moisture a little more frequently. 1st of November, we pulled them again. We have pre-selected sites. Some of them actually began in 1955. We haven't pulled them for a couple of years because the last 2 years we knew we were at field capacity, so we saved our efforts. But we pull them at 1 foot depths, 1 foot increments, 2 5-foot depths. We take that to the research farm, we dry those samples, and we can calculate how much water is available for a plant. With that, we create some maps of what those moisture numbers were. We try to target it 1st of November, so these are numbers from the 1st of November. And you can see numbers anywhere from 6 inches in Lyon County down to 1.5 inches, 1.4 inches, 1.4 inches barely into O'Brien County, 1.5 in western Plymouth County near the town of Akron. If we look at the data from the 1950s through the early 1980s, the November 1 averages for these sites would run anywhere from about 4.5 to 6 inches. 4.5 would be the lowest in western Plymouth County, 6 inches for many of the rest. If you actually look at the number of a data set for those 9 counties that I work in the last, from about 1985 through about 2010, our average would be about 1.5 inches higher. So in general, a lot of those locations are sitting at about 1/3 of what we would normally have or have a long-term average for on 1st of November. Looking back, these numbers are really quite similar, not exact, but quite similar to what we saw in early November 1st of 2011, and also quite similar to what we saw November 1st of 2012, at least in the 9 counties in that map. Differences between the years. 2011 started this dry. 2012 was a dry growing season, although if you look at weather data for those 9 counties, we actually had a little more rain in 2012 than what we had in 2020. But we started with much more soil moisture in 2020, so 2012 was kind of a big crop hit for many producers. Fall of 2012, we were also dry. 2013, we had tremendous recharge in the spring. And so we actually had a pretty good year moisture-wise, and we didn't have the risks that we had in 2012 because we had recharge of that soil profile. Dr. Soterios Argentoulis actually talks about that in his Crops TV section 2, if you want to go back and review that. The fact that we can recharge that fairly rapidly, but we are going to need spring rains to get there. What can we expect over the winter? Normal weather station data says from November 1st to April 15th, we'll get about 6 to 7 inches of moisture at these sites. Through mid-January, we're at about normal from November 1st to mid-January. We often don't count the time period between December 15th to March 1st because the frozen surface and getting snow melt often runs off instead of infiltrates. So to those numbers that you saw on the previous slide, maybe add 4 or 5. That might get us to where we are April 15th, but we're going to pull samples again to take a look. We will need significant recharge past that to get us to where we want to be by June 15th, but we're hoping for that, or we'll need very timely rain. One of the notes that I'll tell you about Northwest Iowa is that we have some really deep loess soils, and we had 3 root pits that we had dug with a backhoe at some of the field days I cooperated with this year. We had one site in Woodbury County where we actually found roots 9 feet deep or even deeper than 9 feet deep. So I think we can use water out of the 6th and 7th foot in years when we really need it. It's not as efficient to get it, but at least we don't run out of water. But at the same time, that zone is drier now too. So instead of maybe needing 8 to 10 more inches of water, we might need 10 to 12 more inches of water instead. Well, that's some background of where we are right now, a little bit about the farm and rainfall and moisture. We're going to make a transition now. Landon Leonard is ag specialist at the research farm. One of his side jobs is being in charge of some of the water quality research. So we're going to turn this over to Landon to share two of the different projects, the wood chip bioreactor, which is fairly new for us in the research farm, and the tidal drainage study, which has been in place since 2015. So here's Landon.
All right, thanks, Joel. Like Joel said, I'm Landon Lenhart. I'm one of the ag specialists at the Northwest Research Farm, and I'm also the water quality specialist at the research farm. And today I'm going to talk about and focus on a couple of projects that we are working on site. Years ago, the Northwest Iowa Experimental Association saw a need for water quality data and research from our area. And since then, we now have 3 projects on the farm. We have a soil surface runoff project, a tile study project, and also our newest is the bioreactor project. Also, before I get started, I want to make sure that everyone knows that Matt Helmers has a Crops TV station as well, and he goes into much more detail on these projects. And if you're looking for any more information, that's a great source. All right, we're going to start with the bioreactor, which is new to some people. It's an edge of field practice, and what a bioreactor is, it's really just a large hole full of wood chips. And what we do with that is we direct tile water into there. And then what occurs is a natural process with bacteria in the hole that uses the wood chips, the carbon from the wood chips as a food source. And then they use the nitrate from the water for respiration. And through that process, we have denitrification, which releases gas into the atmosphere and reduces our nitrates in the water. Some of the things that we can expect from a bioreactor is a 30 to 40% reduction in nitrate. But along with that, there are some costs involved. First, you have your startup cost, which mostly entails the dirt work, as you would imagine. And also there's some tile cost as well, whether addition a tile or the tile that you need to get hooked up to your bioreactor. There may be some cost opportunities though, or cost share opportunities. So you should look for opportunities in your area that might help you with things like that. So I'm going to go through the process of our installation with our bioreactor. This picture here shows kind of a before picture of our before we start the project. As you can see, we're about ready to do some tiling, and this shows our tile pattern that we used. We used 8-inch, 6-inch, and 4-inch tile to be the most efficient with our drainage. For our bioreactor and this installation, we drain about 30 acres of new ground, and that all goes through our bioreactor to be treated. This picture here shows the inlet box to our bioreactor. There's a box in the front and also a box at the end, and that's how we can control the flow through the bioreactor. And also we can bypass the bioreactor if we need to, if there's a large rain event. And that way the tile can still work effectively, and we can treat as much water as possible without backing up our tile. The boxes also allow us to collect our samples. We take a sample of the inlet and of the outlet, and then we can compare those samples to see how much reduction we have from our bioreactor. This is the picture of our liner. Once we dig our pit, and in our case, our bioreactor is 100 feet long by 20 feet wide, and then about 4 feet deep, which is the depth of our tile. So the sides and the bottom are lined with a plastic liner. And then in the next picture is our wood chips being filled. So we fill it all the way up with wood chips as our carbon source for the bacteria. And then on the top, we have a mesh covering that allows the gas to come up out of the bioreactor and through the soil and into the atmosphere. On top of the mesh, we have about 1 to 2 feet of soil, which help us, or we're able to put a pollinator on top of that. So we planted over that, and that ground is will be out of farm use, obviously, because the soil is only 1 to 2 feet deep. So here's our finished product of the bioreactor. As you can tell, there's not a whole lot to see. You can see our inlet and outlet box, and that's about it. Like I said, we will have a pollinator on top of that, so it'll be nice and green. So in this slide, the inflow is shown in the black line and the outflow in the dashed line. And you can tell there's a fairly significant difference in the two, indicating that our bioreactor is doing as we would hope. I think it's interesting to note that almost all of our inflow samples come in at above that 10 parts per million, which is the standard drinking water, and almost all of our outflow come well below that. So if you're ever driving by the research farm, you'll see our new sign out by the road next to our bioreactor. And on our sign are our sponsors. We had a lot of help doing this project, and we really appreciate the help of the Northwest Iowa Experimental Association. Hindstone Digging and Tiling made a very generous donation. They did all of our dirt work and our tiling for us. Princeco supplied us with the tiling and some materials. And then J. Petticourt is where we got our wood chips from. So we'd like to thank all of those groups for helping us out. So now I'm going to switch gears and we're going to talk about our tile study project on the farm. On this map, you can see the locations of other projects around the state. So here's an aerial view of our tile study. As you can see, we have 32 different plots, each individually drained. And of these 32 plots, we have 4 treatments. There's a fall treatment, a spring treatment, a split application, and also a no nitrogen application plot as our control. They are rotated every year, so that comes out to 32 plots. So this is a picture of one of our sumps. As you can see here, all of the tiles come in individually, and so under each plot, we have perforated tile under just the plot that we're trying to collect a sample from. And then that's a solid tile from under that plot all the way to our sumps here so that there's no contamination. Also in between each plot is a curtain tile to prevent any contamination coming in from the sides. When each plot drains and comes into the sump, it is collected and kept separate. Then there's a sump pump that pumps that water through the PVC pipe, as you can see there, and then it goes through a meter, and the meter collects the gallons totals. So then we know how much flow is coming from each plot. And then in each of those lines, we also siphon off a sample, and then we collect those samples a couple times a week when they're flowing, and then we can analyze that data that way. We'll get into the numbers here a little bit. Again, there's 4 treatments. There's a fall anhydrous, there's a spring anhydrous, and then the split anhydrous is 40 pounds of N at planting with a 2x2 band. And then the second comes later, partway through the season, and that is dribbled on top urea as well. And then there's our no treatment, obviously, and each of the treated ones are 135 pounds of N. Okay, so looking at some corn yields here from the past couple years. As you can see, there's not a lot of difference in our fall and spring nitrogen applied, usually pretty similar. Our split nitrogen varies a little bit, and that mostly depends on if we get any rain after our second application of that. And then our no nitrogen, as you can see, that yield is about what you would expect, much less than the others. But I think it is pretty neat that those plots haven't gotten any nitrogen for several years now, and they still yield in that 130 and even up to that 170 range. On this slide, we have our soybean data. And as you can see from that, there's really no statistical difference between any of the yields on that. On this slide is our flow-weighted nitrogen, which is really the main focus of this project. The fall N and the spring N are pretty similar. They do have some variance, but overall they are typically very close. Our split N shows some decrease in nitrates lost, which is encouraging. And then our no N, I think it's important to note that it is the least. However, there still are usually around 10 parts per million that come out of those plots as well, even though no nitrogen has been added for several years. So it appears that we may have hit a baseline there with how much we lose out of those plots, even though no nitrogen is added. So looking back at our yield graphs, if you remember, there wasn't much difference or very slight difference in our yield from the split end plots to our fall or spring and applied plots. But in this graph, you can see that there is some decrease in the nitrates that you would be losing. So that's something to think about moving forward on when you would choose your timing of application. All right, that kind of sums it up for me. Thanks for watching, everyone. Again, Matt Helmer's Crops TV video would be an excellent source for a lot more information. And he also goes over some other water quality projects that they're working on around the state too. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew Weaver.
Hi, my name's Andrew Weaver. I'm an ag specialist at the Northwest Research Farm by Calumet, and then I'm also the on-farm coordinator where we do a lot of trials, some around the farm in Calumet and O'Brien County, and then quite a few in Lyon County to make up for the Dune Farm location that was once there, but we only do on-farm projects. Today, I'm going to talk about a bunch of the row spacing trials that we do at the research farm. These trials were started 5 or 6 years ago. We want to give a thanks to Kinsey along with Pioneer and DeKalb for donating seed for this trial. Kinsey was able to donate row units to put on an old John Deere 7000 toolbar. So for the corn's row spacings, there's 20-inch and 30-inch, and then we're comparing 3 populations along with that, 30, 35,000, and 40,000. When Mark Lick does his analysis of these different trials, anything with a p-value below 0.05 is significant. For the on-farm trials, we usually use 0.1, but for his analysis of these, we use 0.05. So in this first slide, you aren't going to see anything with a p-value of less than 0.05. As we start here, I'm going to talk about this first box here that I'm showing you with my cursor. That box is just comparing the 2 varieties between each other. And again, this trial is not to compare different varieties between companies or even company to company data, but we just got to show it to show the difference between the different populations and different row spacings. So here in this first box here, we're just comparing the 2 varieties. There's no statistical difference between these 2 numbers. So the 2 varieties showed about the same. And then we go down to this next box here, and this is showing the 2 varieties with the different populations with them. And then if you move over here, it's taking the 2 varieties and it's averaging them out and then just showing the differences between the populations. So here you can see that between the populations, there's no statistical difference. And then as we move down here to this box here, it's showing the 2 varieties comparing the 2 row spacings, so the 20 versus 30s. And again, there's no statistical difference between the 2 varieties with the 2 spacings. Then you move over here and then it's showing the 2 varieties that are averaged, but with the spacings and the populations. The box that we show over here is just the 2 spacings comparing each other. And again, no statistical difference between anything on this slide. I guess I do want to point out too that these 2 hybrids are the 2 Wiffle hybrids, and then I'm going to show you the 2 DeKalb hybrids and the 2 Pioneer hybrids. 6 varieties, 3 companies, 3 populations, and 2 spacings. So as we move into this slide, these are the 2 DeKalb varieties, and again, I'm going to show you. We'll get faster as we kind of go through, as there's several of these, but this is just showing the 2 hybrids. No statistical difference between the 2. Moving down here, again, no statistical difference. As we move over to the populations, they do show a statistical difference. So when you see this 155.5 with the B behind it, the B shows that there is a statistical difference between the 159.8 because it has an A behind it. And then as you move to the 40,000 here, there's statistical difference between the 40,000 and the 30,000, but not the 35,000 because they both have the letter A behind them. But yeah, as we go down here to the spacings, you don't see a statistical difference between any of these. And then, yeah, so we get down to the 20-inch versus the 30-inch, and there's only about 0.2 bushels difference here. As we move on to the 2 Pioneer hybrids, again, we're going to show you there's no statistical difference between the 2 hybrids. There's no statistical difference between the different populations. And as we move over to the row spacings, we do actually see a statistical difference between the 20-inch versus the 30-inch, with the 20-inch having about a 5 bushel difference. So now we're going to go back to 2019, which we found pretty interesting. Again, we've done this trial for over 6 years, and we've never seen the 20-inch actually have a big improvement between the 30-inch. But last year, we did see a difference between all 3 different companies. So this was interesting. We're going to start with the Whiffles here again. There was a statistical difference between the 2 hybrids. The Whiffles 5516 was about 7 bushel better than the other variety. And then as kind of we move on here, there was a statistical difference between the 3 populations as well. As you can see with the letter behind, the B is different than the 2 A's. So the 30,000 was significantly different than the 35 and the 40,000 by about 6 bushel. As we move farther down, you're gonna get over to the spacings over here, and you're gonna see about a 14 bushel difference with an advantage to the 20-inch. We haven't seen this before, but we did see this last year, and then 2020, like I just showed you, kind of went back to what we saw the previous years before 2019. As we move to the 2 DeKalb hybrids, again, the one variety was quite a bit better than the other one and had a p-value of 0.001, so pretty statistically different. And then we're going to slide over again, and I'll just summarize this, but we're going to slide to the 20 versus the 30-inch, and there was about a 9 bushel difference between the 2 spacings, and with an advantage to the 20-inch. Moving to the 2 Pioneer hybrids, again, there was a statistical difference between the 2 hybrids, and then kind of moving over to the 20 versus the 30. And there's actually a typo here. The 232 and the 20-inch should actually have an A behind it. So there was a 10 bushel advantage to the 20-inch versus the 30-inch, again, just like we kind of saw in the previous 2 slides. Now we're going to shift gears to the soybean population and row spacing trials. So this one, we do it a little bit different. It's basically the same, but there's only 2 companies. There'll be 2 Bayer hybrids, and there's 2 Corteva hybrids. We do 3 spacings with this one though, so there'll be a 15, a 20-inch, and a 30-inch. Which creates quite a bit of work for us because we end up having to dump quite a few boxes. As we start into this, it's set up the same, kind of confusing, but once you get the hang of it, it does show what we're trying to see. So on this slide, there's going to be no p-value of less than 0.05, so there's going to be nothing that's statistically different. In summary, we get down here, and there's between the 3 spacings, there is no advantage to the 15 or the 20 versus the 30. And then as we kind of go back up into here, I should show that we went all the way down to 90,000. The previous 3 years before this, we were at 120, 150, and 180, and we weren't seeing any difference between the low spacing, so we thought we'd drop it down another 30,000. So these previous 2 years, we've done 90,000, 120,000, and 150,000. And again, we did not see an advantage to planting more seeds per acre. Here we're moving on to the 2 Corteva varieties. There wasn't a statistical difference between the 2 varieties. Again, there was no statistical difference between the 3 populations, which again in soybeans is kind of significant because even all the way down to 90,000, we did not see any yield deduction between planting way less seeds. And then we move over to the spacings. And again, it kind of looks like there should be a statistical difference because there's about 3 bushel here. But the statistics say that there isn't because it's still a 0.17. Moving ahead to 2019, these are the 2 Corteva hybrids. There was a statistical difference between the 2 varieties by about 4 bushel. And then moving down to the populations, there wasn't a statistical difference between the 3. And again, at 90,000, 120,000, and 150,000. And then moving down to the spacings, there was not a statistical advantage to the 15 versus the 30s or the 20s. Moving on to the 2 Bayer hybrids, there wasn't a statistical difference between the 2 varieties, as well as there was not a maturity difference because there was the 2 Bayer varieties are a 2.0 and a 2.1. Moving ahead to the populations, there was no statistical difference between those 3. And then moving down to the spacings, we did see about a 2.5 bushel advantage to the spacings with the 15-inch versus the 20 and the 30s. But the 20 and 30s were about the same. So here we're going to move on to some on-farm trials or summaries of on-farm trials that we've done in comparison to those 2 or to the row spacing trials that we do at the farm. So this is about 9 years worth of on-farm soybean row spacing trials. These were done before I was was an employee here. These were done by Josh Severs and Joel DeYoung. But when Josh first started the on-farm program, this was one of the big ones that they hit on because they were kind of not easy to do, but they were intriguing to farmers because people were trying to move to narrower spacings. So there was 14 trials done between 2008 and 2017 between 15-inch and 30-inch. And the 15-inch, over all of these years, there was 14 trials, as I said, but there was a 2 bushel advantage to the 15-inch versus the 30-inch. And 5 of the 14 trials showed at least a 3 bushel increase with narrow row spacings. And then there was also 8 trials done with 18-inch versus 36-inch. So these guys were still planting wide corn at the time, and they just double planted those. So we were down to 18-inch spacings. But here we saw about a 4 bushel advantage to the narrow row spacings, and 5 of the 8 showed at least a 3 bushel increase with narrow rows. So I think as the spacings were 6 inches wider, we do actually see an advantage to going less than 36 inches or narrower than 36 inches. Here's an interesting one that I guess we wanted to point out just because it's different than what we usually see. But the 30-inch rows were actually 5 bushel better here than the 15-inch rows, but that was because of a pretty high level of white mold in the plot. So basically what we've put into conclusion here is that with white mold and narrow rows, the white mold does do quite a bit more harm just because there's a higher pressure of white mold with 15-inch spacings versus the 30s. With the 30s, it seems like there's more air that gets down through there, and that helps with drying some of those out. Here I'm going to show you a slide of the 2020 on-farm population trial that was done at Dordt University. Iowa State Extension and the on-farm projects do a collaboration with Dordt University, so we do about 9 to 12 projects a year. So I would like to thank them for all of their work, and because it does make it a lot easier. They do all of the data collection, and then I just get all the numbers. So here, this one was done. We did 4 populations here, 90, 110, 130, and 150. And then within that, we did 2 planting dates. So there was an early planting date, which was April 21st. And then we did a late planting date that was on May 9th. So I guess what I want to show you here is that the C's show that there was no statistical difference between any of those. As we look down below that, the C's do show a statistical difference between the late planting date. So here's another one of them rare occurrences where we see about 8-9 bushels advantage planting May 9th. And again, we really don't know why that is, but I do want to show that. And then there is no statistical difference between the populations. So even on the early planting date, there was only about a bushel difference, and they did not show a statistical difference. And then as we go down there, the 90,000 was about 3 bushel difference in the 150, but it was not statistically different. One thing that Mike Witt has added to the on-farm stuff this year was he's doing a price analysis. There's a profit per acre over here, and it showed that the 110,000 planted on May 9th was the most profitable. Basically just because there was a bigger yield advantage, but we didn't plant very many seeds either. So it was a low population. But moving on, here's a summary of the 2019 soybean population trials. So again, this first one was done at Dordt. There was no statistical difference between any of those populations. The 90,000 held up just as well as the 140,000. I guess moving down through some of these Lyon County ones, basically we're showing the exact same thing. That 100,000 held pretty true to the 165,000 all the way through. Here, this one, there was about a 3 bushel advantage, but again, probably didn't pay for that seed that you're saving between the 65,000 that you didn't plant. And then these other two were about the same between the low populations and the high populations. And then one note that we have been pointing out when we show this slide, you're figuring $60 a bag of seed at 140,000. Those 20,000 seeds cost about $8.57 an acre. So here's a summary of the soybean plant populations through 2018, all the way back to when the on-farm trials first started. So we kind of tried to average. Basically, we tried to pick 2 populations that we did in basically all the trials, and then we took the data and averaged between the 2. So we got 125,000 here and 175,000, and basically it's showing that 125,000 through 39 trials, which is quite a few. There was only about a 0.3 bushel difference. So it just kind of shows that we can probably afford to try and plant a few less seeds per acre. I'm not saying that I'd recommend going all the way down to 90,000 yet, but I think it does show that we don't need to be at those high populations anymore. So here's a 2020 soybean data planning trial that was done at the research farm in collaboration with the Iowa Soybean Association. So there's two varieties that were planted. One was a 2.3 and one was a 2.8 maturity. Two different planting dates, one April 24th and then another one about a month later on May 22nd. And basically what I want to show you here is that you got to kind of look because they're not in order here. The 2.3s, so the early planting date was about 5 bushel better than the late planting date on those 2.3 maturities. But then we only saw about a 2 bushel increase between the early and the late planting date on the 2.8 maturities. Here is a summary of all of the Sioux County data planting trials. So most of these were probably done at Dort. Again, some of these years I was not here to be a part of them. But one thing that we wanted to point out on this slide was the only year where the early planting was worse than the late planting was 2015. There was about a 5 bushel difference. But as you kind of look through some of these numbers, you get all the way up to about an 8 bushel increase by planting about 2 or 3 weeks ahead. So one thing that I guess Joel and I have talked about, or Joel kind of recommends, is that I don't know if we need to be planting soybeans first, but it does help to, as soon as we get done with that corn, to slide in and start doing soybeans, because we do see a pretty good yield response to planting soybeans early. And that'll wrap up my part of the presentation here. I'm going to turn it back over to Joel DeYoung to finish this out. I want to thank you for tuning in today.
Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate your insights. Let's move on and talk about the corn rootworm on-farm project next. Last winter, as we were doing our private pesticide applicator continuing instruction courses throughout the state of Iowa, we also did a survey of our crop producers that were participating in those meetings. We also conducted a survey with a few other locations, but most of the 5,000 surveys we got back actually came from our pesticide applicators at training sessions last winter. We asked several questions. One of the questions that we asked, what was the biggest insect concern that you have? And since we also asked for county, we could separate those out by crop reporting district. Well, the Northwest Research Farm is actually in crop reporting district number 1. So you can see from this slide that the biggest concern our producers have in this part of the state is rootworms. About equally split between northerns and westerns, but rootworms, from all the insects they deal with, are the ones that create the biggest issues for them. As we look at the data, one of the things we need to remember is that corn rootworms, of course, cause damage by feeding on roots. When we look at evaluating the effectiveness of different treatments, the way we often do it is look at yield, of course. But the second thing is to evaluate how much injury was done to the root system by the corn rootworms. Rootworms typically feed on roots from early June through about mid-July. And so in late July, we often like to get into fields, dig some roots, wash off those roots, and evaluate for how many have been chewed off. And so the rating scale we use is a 0 to 3 rating scale. A 0 means that all the roots are intact. We really don't see any evidence that corn rootworms are feeding on them. A 1 would be a whole node or ring of roots would be chewed off. And a reminder, a ring, the number of roots in a ring will depend on hybrid, but often from 8 to 12 roots on a node. So, you know, if we have 10 roots chewed off, whether it's the same node or not, we'd be at about a 1. On the left-hand side, it's a pretty good example of what a quarter node injury looks like. We've got about, 2 to 3 roots that are chewed off. The rest are still intact. And often if it's 2 or 3, it'll be in one side of the plant, not the whole way around. On the right-hand side, that actually would be a 0.5, but you'd have to spin it to see that about half of the node of roots are gone. And a 1 would be basically a whole node chewed off to within 1.5 inches of the crown. And that's what that picture on the left now would show you. Quick note, most research would indicate that a node of roots chewed off typically will cost you about 15% yield. If you give me a marginal moisture year, it might be higher. If you get plenty of rainfall and everything's perfect, it could be much less. But in general, about 15% yield loss per node that's gone. We've been working with Dort University, and particularly Mike Scouten, who's kind of the farm manager at Dort University's farm. That's one of our on-farm projects we've been conducting with them for years. This site, we've actually been doing a similar project of this for almost 10 years now, maybe even more than 10 years. It's a site with multiple years of corn on corn. And One of the things we've been trying to do is go back to the same location, field length strips, replicated. I believe we've run them replicated 4 times every time. We've been trying to compare hybrids that are sister hybrids. Usually what we've tried to do is try to compare sister hybrids that has one with no below ground BT traits. One of the sisters would have a single BT rootworm trait, and the other one would be a stacked BT rootworm trait. However, as we move forward, it's tougher and tougher to get the single BT rootworm trait hybrids. And so what you'll see in this slide is we've only got 2 hybrids we're comparing this year, both of them with and without insecticide. Now, in the early years, when we had these hybrids out there, the BT traits, the single one and the stacks worked just fine. When we were rating roots, we would see root ratings of 0.1 or better all the time on anything with a BT trait, you know, and it performed well. But over time, we've seen more and more damage to those hybrids with BT traits, the single one and even the stacked one. And so we're really starting to get concerned about some resistance issues. Looking closely at this slide, you go to the bottom and you look at the hybrid with only above ground BT, so there's no rootworm BT trait out there, and no insecticide. We had almost 2.5 nodes of roots chewed off on average from those plants that we dug and we evaluated. Not only that, it wasn't fun getting those samples because lodging in late July was already quite significant. So if you're carrying buckets with roots in them, you do fall down. So that's part of what happens. You can see what it did to yield. It's about that 45% yield loss that we talked about with 15% per node. So at 94.3, it really hit us. This was a very dry neighborhood, dry all season in Northwest Iowa. It was actually one of the drier ones. So it's amazing to me that our best yield was still at 174.5. On the above ground BT, when we added an insecticide, we ended up still with 3/4 of a node gone, which is pretty significant. I would note that in dry years, we have a history of thinking that corn rootworm insecticides don't perform quite as well. They don't move very much out of that zone where they're applied. Roots obviously grow out of that zone, so we can seem to have some more damage on the dry year, and our performance isn't typically quite as good in a dry year as it is on a normal rainfall year. We put the BT rootworm trait out there. We can see what it did for yield for us. And then we added an insecticide. It gave us about 6 more bushels. But when we take a look at the root ratings for that small smart stack hybrid without insecticide, we averaged 1.25 nodes gone. Creates great concern for me. Like I said, 10 years ago, these things would be squeaky clean. And now we got 1.25 nodes gone without an insecticide. So we're putting a lot of pressure on these critters out here. And I think we're really encouraging some resistance. And it has been a concern more widespread in Northwest Iowa. And that's why we're looking at this project. Couple notes, corn on corn. We have a lot of corn on corn, lots of livestock. Secondly, in these fields, the only beetle we really saw out there was a Western corn rootworm beetle. A quick review of that. Westerns are the ones that have shown resistance to the BT rootworm traits. Northerns have not. Northerns have the extended diapause trait. Westerns do not. And so how we trade them in a corn bean versus a corn-corn rotation needs to be something you pay attention to. I'm not going to go into more details, but I will encourage you again to watch Erin Hodgson's session on corn rootworms that she is doing for Crops TV also. This isn't the first year, so we have some other year data too. This is 2019, and in 2019, we had more rainfall that year, and so our numbers are going to be a little different. You're going to see that all 3 of those hybrids, whether it's a single BT rootworm trait, a stacked BT rootworm trait, or the conventional, when we added the insecticide, we had virtually the same yield. And so we saw in 2019 a very effective control just with our insecticide. So the ability to think about rotating treatments instead of going back to the same well all the time, this might be some data that might give you some encouragement to say that at times, maybe we need to not use a BT trait, so maybe we can try to mix it up. But again, the real answer is if you've got a problem going on and you've been in corn on corn, rotation will get rid of these critters. These Westerns are going to starve that year in soybeans. So it has been a good option for us. Another note, your conventional hybrid with no insecticide, we had just a bit over 3/4 of a node gone, so pressure wasn't nearly as high. Had a big rain or two in June at this site in 2019. Larvae don't swim well, and I think perhaps we drowned some to keep some of that pressure in check. But even this year in 2019, the Smart Stack still had 1/3 of a node gone. The VT3 by itself had 1/2 of a node gone. Our control just by the BT has not gotten better over time, that's for certain. 2018, a little higher pressure year. You can see the conventional at 1.13 nodes gone. Yield wise, we still saw a boost for using an insecticide with it every time. So am I going to recommend an insecticide with the BT rootworm trait on corn? No, I think there are other methods that don't encourage resistance maybe quite as much. But I know practically, in all practicality, a lot of our producers are going to stick with corn, have been putting that practice in place. Again, you see 6/10 of a node gone with the Smart Stacks, almost 7/10 with the single rootworm trait hybrid. Some concerns about its effectiveness. In 2017 was a big pressure year. We had 2.2 nodes gone on the conventional. Again, anytime you see a traded hybrid with more than a node gone, makes me really wonder about resistance. Now, there's no quick test to tell if there's resistance or not, and we haven't shipped any of the adults to Ames to have them go through the lab test where they feed roots to next year's larvae to find out if they're resistant. But when we have that much damage, yeah, we might have had a lot of pressure, but at the same time, we should have gotten better control with the BT traits than that. So I'm starting to think we're seeing some problems. So thinking about that issue is important. And again, listen to Aaron's presentation. I think that's a great idea. Switching gears for another topic. You're probably asking, what's that interesting piece of equipment that's sitting there? Well, this is fungicides, and this is the Northwest Research Farm's equipment that they use to spray fungicide plots. They took an old detasseling machine and they retrofitted it for spraying fungicides, and you can see there's 10 booms on there. So they have 10 different small tanks up there for spraying small plots. You can see that that boom can go up and down. It can be over a canopy. It can be for a ground application for bare ground. So they've got quite the variety and the ability to spray out there. They've got a controller so they can change products real quickly. And so it takes them 40 minutes to spray a fairly extensive plot now that used to take them all day when they had to walk it by hand with a boom over their head and that white suit on to keep them from raining down on themselves. So they're much more efficient and much safer for the applicator to actually be using this product. So it's another case that I'm really proud of our research farm folks for. When they see a need for something unique, they go ahead and they can create it themselves at times. Allison Robertson, in an earlier crop TV series, did spend some time on corn fungicide trials, and I'm just going to show a couple of her trials, and I thank Allison for sharing them with me. Those are called her cardinal trials. Those are the sites that she does work every year, and she looks at a lot of different products and different timings and all sorts of things, and shares that data every year. For example, a couple slides. This is one that about 3 years ago, she started doing some 12-leaf or V12 applications. She did them again in 2020. Now, 2020 at the sites in Iowa, we didn't have a whole lot of disease pressure. In fact, very little because it was so dry. But in 2020 at the V12 time period, she didn't see much response. In fact, if you average all those treatments together, it was a negative response, but virtually a zero response this year. Interestingly, that chart, if you look at it for very long, you'll see that there's really not any good trends where some products work better than others in 2020. In 2018, she had some that worked a little better. And in 2018, she had this time period, she saw a better response. But the last 2 years, her response from this V12 application wasn't as positive as it was in 2018. In 2021, these are her R1. These are her, early soaking applications from across the state. The darker blues are the averages of all sites, if I remember right, or sites in other parts of the state. The purples from the Northeast Research Farm, the blues in the Northwest Research Farm. Again, with the R1 applications, there's not a great trend that shows some actually stacking up in the same location. You'll see them kind of spread out. In 2018, she had some products kind of sort themselves to the top. Some of those newer products seem to give a little more help, but the last 2 years couldn't really separate them statistically that much. But again, not much pressure. So her statewide on-farm small plot research did not have a very good yield response this past year. You know, at the same time, I talk to producers in Northwest Iowa a lot over the time, and I have some that swear to me that they get 10 bushels or better every year. And then I've got others that say, man, I never see anything for a yield response. So we like to actually haul the high boy off of the research farm. And, you know, a normal applicator, we could go out and spray some fields of our cooperators. And every year we've done that for several years. This year, in 2020, we only had 3 sites where we went. One was in Sioux County. That's a farm that's been no-tilled. All 3 of these are corn following soybeans. All 3 of them were planted the 3rd week of April. 30-inch corn. And in the first site, approach Prima was used. And if you look at the statistics, there was no statistical increase in yield. So we put them in the same category. So we didn't see any yield difference this year. And that site, we had 2 sites where Quilt Excel was a product. One was in O'Brien County, one was in Cherokee County, both of them conventionally tilled, both planted that same week, and also 30-inch rows. You don't see a statistical difference in either one of those this year either. So those 3 sites pretty much match what Allison was seeing in Northwest Iowa. I hear that comment once in a while that in a dry year, a fungicide helps reduce respiration and will increase your yield, and maybe so. But the data set that we're looking at doesn't seem to show that this year. Maybe somebody else's does, but for us, it hasn't. Last year, we had a little more response. These are some of the sites from last year that we had out there. On O'Brien County site, we had Quilt Excel that we tried at R2 and Lucento at VT. You know, both of those were statistically better than the control, 4 to 8 bushels better. So we did see an increase there. Actually, the Lucento wasn't statistically better than the control, but if we were at the 0.1 range, I think it probably would have been. So that was a positive one. In Sioux County, we actually had a site that was oats the previous year, but it was corn last year. Approach Prima, that was also at Dordt University. And so the students wanted to take a look at an early morning application versus a middle of the afternoon application to see if there was a difference. They used Approach Prima in the morning and Approach Prima in the afternoon. At 0.1, they were statistically different. At a 0.05, they were not, and that's what the letter shows there. So if you take a look at that, we didn't quite get to carry it out as well as we wanted to. The 76-degree air temperature tells me that it wasn't done first thing in the morning, which I'm sure you picked up. What it actually tells me is that we had equipment problems, so we couldn't get going as early in the morning as we targeted. But we were there that day, so that's why we got it sprayed. But again, we probably saw a little bit of a yield difference of, you know, 4 to 8 bushels last year too. 4 to 6 bushels last year. And then we had Moravis Neo at a field in Sioux County. It was statistically better at the 0.1 level with that fungicide. So 2019 was a little more responsive year, not home runs, but a little more consistent of what we're seeing. So how do our on-farm guys, you know, this is their farmer fields, it's field length, it's replicated plots. How do they decide which products to use? There's 2 different things that make a difference. Number one is it's products maybe they're going to be using and they want to look at it. Secondly, we have some very friendly representatives of these products out there that often will share some with us and do that. Our cooperators don't get paid a thing. They just want the information. They're willing to take the time to do replications and put up with us. We greatly appreciate that, but we do share that information with others, and hopefully they find it useful. And a last slide for that, corn fungicides in Northwest Iowa. We have done, and these are all ground application trials, and these are between VT and R2, depending on how soon we can get there and what the timing is the cooperator wants. We didn't separate out products. Probably 80% are corn following soybean. The rest, almost all the rest, are going to be corn following corn. We haven't seen any real data differences in our trials, but other times I think we can sometimes see that in other people's trials. We put all the fungicides together. This is just all the data. We've had 54 different in-field trials over that time period, and we've averaged a little over 6 bushels per acre from all those. You see about a quarter of them are probably 10 bushels or more. You'll see half of them are 5 bushels or more. You know, with $5 corn or better, you know, it pays to get down to that level. You know, if we have $3 corn, it takes a few more bushels to break even. And at $3 corn, maybe that $6 average isn't, that's the bushels per acre isn't enough. So it's always a question that our producers ask in Northwest Iowa. I fully believe that disease pressure makes a big difference. In Northwest Iowa, it just annually doesn't get as much disease pressure as some of the rest of the state, but there are times and years where we do. Okay, a bonus topic for us. Soybean gall midges. In the northwest corner of Iowa, soybean gall midge is definitely an issue. We've been part of the research project that Aaron Hodgson talked about in that first episode of Crops TV that was done live in early December that you can find archived. Soybean gall midges, we learned a lot about their life cycle. The Northwest Research Farm has had a lot of problems with gall midges. We've had some plots that actually have been ruined because the gall midges got too far into the replicated trials. But we've tried to look at, helped use that information to identify life cycles. And actually have used one location on the farm where we had gall midges a year ago. We planted soybeans there again this year to try to get the population up so we could look at some different treatments. I'll let you know that I don't have data here for another project, but in Plymouth County, I've been doing some spraying, post-emerge spraying with insecticides every time the beetles, the larvae are emerging from cages. So every generation, we're trying to get an insecticide on those soybeans. And so far, we haven't seen much positive response in my work for putting a foliar insecticide on those plants to try to control gall midge. Hard to get at them because they're under the skin of the plant, but I haven't had much success. But there has been some projects that maybe are going to give us a little bit of hope, something to watch at least, and we'll see what happens. At the Northwest Research Farm, this past year, they worked with AMVAC to take a look at a plot, a soybean on soybean area, to try to find if there's a soil applied insecticide that helps. There was some excitement perhaps in 2019 that maybe Thimet with planting could give us some help. And I guess I'm still have my interest piqued based on this trial at the Northwest Research Farm, where 6 ounces in a T-band did seem to help our yield, 3 to 4 bushels. You could visually see some differences between treatments out there. But what was interesting is, and I think the labeled rate for Thimet is actually 9 ounces per 1,000 foot of row. We didn't see that response. We saw a negative response. So I think it's something we need to look at into the future, but that's work AMVAC did cooperatively at the research farm. My friend at Dordt University did share this with me. They also had a trial at the Dordt University farm. They looked at counter and Thimet at that site. A note, Thimet is labeled for soybeans. When I looked at the label, counter is not at this stage of the game, so that would be an experimental treatment at this stage. You'll see that the dead, infected, and healthy look much better with Thimet than either counter or the untreated. But we had a nice yield boost with Thimet. Counter gave us some hope in this trial too. So something to keep an eye on. I'm not sure it's going to work. Maybe if you want to experiment, you can legally do that with Thimet on your end rows. Maybe that'll give you some help if you've had some long-term problems. But I also understand the Iowa Soybean Association and University of Nebraska have some trials too. I have not seen that data yet, but I'd encourage you to look if it's of interest to you. There's more. Those aren't all the trials that are out there. Mike Witt, my counterpart from West Central Iowa, is going to be doing another Crops TV session looking at on-farm trials. The research farm reports are posted on the web for all the research farms in the state of Iowa at this website. Truthfully, this year's data probably won't be printed until February, if not March, before it's available online. But keep your eyes open. There's always good information in there, and I encourage you to go take a look at that information. Thank you for watching today. I also want to thank Landon and Andrew for their work, and Brent Prignitz for being behind the board all the time to make sure we're looking good in the mix. As always, if you want more information, please feel free to contact me at that email address there. If you want a copy, a PDF copy of the slides we used today, send me an email. I'll gladly share them with you. And with that, I want to say thank you. I hope you learned something today, and I hope you're enjoying Crops TV.